This is Haley, and welcome back to Case 0360. Tonight's case is one that continues to shock true crime audiences years after it first made headlines, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the age of the person at the center of it, the family that was destroyed, and the extraordinary act of forgiveness that followed. This is Case 0360, and tonight we examine the story of Erin Caffey. In many true crime cases, investigators begin with a mystery, a missing person, an unknown suspect, a trail of evidence leading toward an answer. But in this case, the facts emerged relatively quickly. The challenge was understanding why. How could a seemingly ordinary teenage girl become connected to a crime so devastating that it would permanently alter multiple lives forever? And how could a father who survived the attack eventually choose forgiveness over hatred? To understand the story, we need to go back to the beginning. In the small community where the Caffey family lived, they appeared to be a typical family. They attended church. They were known by neighbors. They followed routines familiar to countless American households. Erin Caffey was a teenager navigating the complicated years of adolescence. Friends described her as normal. Family members believed they knew her. But behind the scenes, tensions had reportedly begun to develop over a romantic relationship. Like many parents, Terry and Penny Caffey were concerned about who their daughter was spending time with. They believed certain influences were unhealthy and attempted to establish boundaries. For most families, disagreements over relationships are temporary conflicts. In this case, investigators would later allege that those disagreements became the foundation for something far more dangerous. As the conflict intensified, a plan allegedly began to take shape. Authorities would later determine that Erin's boyfriend, along with accomplices, became involved in discussions that escalated from frustration to violence. What started as teenage rebellion reportedly transformed into a conspiracy, and that conspiracy would eventually end in tragedy. One night, the plan moved from discussion to action. According to court records and investigative findings, multiple individuals entered the family home. What happened next was horrific. The attack targeted members of the Caffey family while they were inside their own house. By the time the violence ended, multiple family members had lost their lives. The home itself was then set on fire in what investigators believed was an attempt to destroy evidence and conceal what had happened. But one person survived. Terry Caffey. Despite suffering severe injuries, he managed to escape the burning home. His survival would become one of the most important factors in the entire investigation. Because while physical evidence would help reconstruct events, Terry's testimony provided investigators with critical insight into the people involved and the circumstances surrounding the crime. When law enforcement arrived and began processing the scene, they quickly realized they were dealing with something far beyond an accidental fire. The evidence pointed toward intentional violence. Investigators worked to establish timelines, identify potential suspects, and determine who had both motive and opportunity. As interviews were conducted and evidence was collected, attention eventually focused on individuals connected to Erin's social circle. Phone records, witness statements, and investigative findings began creating a picture that pointed toward a planned attack rather than a spontaneous act. For detectives, the emerging details were difficult to comprehend. The allegations suggested that the attack was not committed by strangers. Instead, it involved people connected to the family through personal relationships. That realization transformed the case from a traditional homicide investigation into something far more emotionally complex. As arrests were made and charges were filed, the story captured national attention. People across the country struggled to understand how events could escalate to such an extreme level. Questions dominated public discussion. What motivates a teenager to become involved in a crime against her own family? How much influence did others have? Where did responsibility begin and end? These questions would continue long after convictions were secured. As legal proceedings moved forward, prosecutors presented evidence outlining the alleged planning and coordination behind the attack. Defense teams presented their own perspectives. Witnesses testified. Investigators explained their findings, and eventually, the courts reached conclusions that would determine the futures of those involved. Erin Caffey received a lengthy prison sentence that would keep her incarcerated for decades. For many observers, the sentence reflected the severity of the crime and the devastating consequences of the decisions that had been made. But while the legal chapter moved toward resolution, another aspect of the story was only beginning: the story of Erin Caffey. In most cases involving crimes of this magnitude, surviving family members carry unimaginable grief. Many struggle with anger. Many struggle with trauma. Many spend years trying to process what happened. Terry faced all of those challenges. Yet over time, he made a decision that surprised many people. He chose forgiveness. That choice became one of the most discussed and debated aspects of the entire case. For some, forgiveness seemed impossible to understand. How could someone forgive after experiencing such loss? How could someone choose compassion after enduring such pain? For Terry, forgiveness was not about excusing what happened. It was not about denying the tragedy. Instead, he explained it as a way of freeing himself from the burden of hatred. His perspective attracted widespread attention because it challenged assumptions about how victims and survivors are expected to respond. Many people viewed his choice as extraordinary. Others found it difficult to comprehend. But regardless of individual opinion, it became a defining part of the story. Years later, interest in the case remained strong. That is one reason interviews involving Erin Caffey continue to attract attention. People are searching for answers. They want insight into how someone involved in such a devastating crime reflects on those events years later. They want to understand whether remorse exists, whether understanding has developed, whether time has changed perspectives. In interviews, those questions often become central, not because answers can undo the past, but because people naturally seek explanations for actions that seem impossible to understand. The challenge is that true crime rarely provides simple explanations. Human behavior is complicated, relationships are complicated, decision-making is complicated, and when multiple individuals influence one another, the line between influence and responsibility can become difficult to examine. What remains undeniable is the impact. Lives were lost, a family was shattered, a community was changed, and multiple people spent years confronting consequences that can never fully be undone. As true crime audiences revisit this case, it serves as a reminder of how quickly poor decisions can escalate when anger, manipulation, immaturity, and violence intersect. It also highlights the importance of recognizing warning signs before situations spiral beyond control. Because many tragedies are not created in a single moment. They develop through a series of choices that seem small at first, choices that gradually become larger, until eventually there is no easy way back. Today, the case continues to be discussed not only because of the crime itself, but because of the extraordinary contrast at its center. On one side, a devastating act of violence that shocked the nation. On the other, a survivor who chose forgiveness in circumstances where many believed forgiveness was impossible. That contrast remains one of the reasons the story continues to resonate with audiences years later. This is Haley, reporting for Case 0360. And sometimes the most difficult question in true crime is not how a crime happened, but how those left behind find a way to keep living afterward.